Okay. Hi, Kaylin. How are you?
Hi, Douglas. I'm great. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on this show. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
So, you're a PhD in reproductive pathology.
Yes.
Okay. Does that has nothing to do with your books, or does it have something to do with your
Um,
books?
well, I also have an interest in reproductive toxicology, and I did weave the toxicology into the book just a tiny bit. Um, if your readers are familiar with Agent Orange, dioxin, it was a contaminant, and that's the reason Agent Orange was so deadly to humans. And because I study dioxin, I couldn't write a book about the Vietnam War and not put just a tiny bit into that. When the book, I think it's mostly, history and mystery with just a little tiny bit of science.
Okay. So your books. This is a series, right?
It is. I didn't know it was going to be a series when I wrote the first one, but after I wrote the first one, I just felt like I hadn't done enough and decided I wanted to do a trilogy. And I changed the book cover of the first book to say book one of the trilogy before I had any idea what the third book was going to be about. But I do now. So the second book is out, and the third book hopefully sometime later this year.
Okay. So what's the title of the first and second book?
The first book is called Time Intertwined, and the second book is Lives Intertwined.
Now, you said this is about Vietnam. Is this about a particular character in Vietnam? Is it a fiction, or is it like
It's
more of a?
historical fiction.
It's historical fiction.
So,
Okay.
yeah, so the first book was inspired by a true story, something that happened in my family. Now, the story in the book is fiction, except for the history is accurate to the best of my knowledge. But so my ex-husband happens to be Vietnamese, and a couple of years ago, I thought it'd be really interesting to get our DNA tested. I had no idea what I was, and he turned out, he's 30% Chinese, which he didn't know that he was, and I'm 30% Irish. And then our kids, we've got two sons. They're just, a mix of all of these different things, and it was really very interesting. And but then a couple of months later, I was contacted by a guy who was looking for his birth mother. And we didn't know anything about him, but he was clearly related to my ex husband and my kids. And the story that transpired um, just really touched me. And I really felt like the story needed to be told. But it wasn't my story, and I didn't have enough details to really write that. And I just thought, well, I could do a fictional account that had elements of his story in it. And so that's what I did. But then again, and the reason it's called Time Intertwined, there are a couple of different timelines. One that starts in Vietnam in the 1950s and goes all the way up to 2020. And then the other timeline is mostly in the United States, and it occurs over the year 2020. And at the end of the book, the two timelines converge. But that's why it's called Time Intertwined. But I just couldn't tell a story that was set during the Vietnam War and not talk about Agent Orange. And so that's woven in there, like I said, just a little bit. But I think it's an important part of the story.
I'll get back to Agent Orange in a second. I wanted to ask you something about your ex-husband. Was he there during the time of the war?
He was born in 1964 in Saigon, and they left after the fall of Saigon and immigrated here. Um,
Oh,
his,
was
yeah.
he one of the people climbing on the roof for the famous picture from the embassy?
He won't talk about it very much. I know that they were on a boat at one point and then they were on a plane. He really won't talk to me much about it. Um, and after I was doing the research for the book, I kind of understood a little bit more about why he doesn't want to talk about it. That was one of the hardest chapters for me to write when my character is escaping from Vietnam. And um, but his father worked for the Americans, and they were promised safe passage. And there were just too many people that they were trying to get out there at the end. And eventually, I guess Mr. Tran just said, if we're going to go, I got to take care of this. And I don't know how they got out. It was, you know, five siblings and two parents, but they all got here. They're doing really well.
Well,
I'm
that
sorry that it's just so emotional, and I wasn't there, but just reading so many stories about how difficult it was, and I really appreciated, and I don't think I knew this before, how much the Americans that were still there, tried so hard to get as many people out as they could, because we just didn't know what the North Vietnamese would do to people that had been on our side.
Well, if you look at what just happened in Afghanistan, a lot of people were
Yes,
making the comparison that it was exactly the same thing.
it was. Yeah,
And
it felt
yeah,
like it.
and we had much better media coverage of Afghanistan than we did at Vietnam. So I can imagine that it was very difficult for people. And even with your emotional reaction there, yeah, it's not easy. I mean, I feel for anybody who had to escape that kind of horror, thinking that
And
they
to make
might,
that choice,
yeah, and to make that
they
choice.
left family.
Right.
And Mr. Tran, my ex-husband's father, always wanted to go back. And, he's in his 80s now, and it's probably not going to happen.
Well, that whole country has changed.
It has, and it's actually doing a lot better than I think any of us anticipated. I mean, the government is, largely communist, but it's they're open to business. They're open to people coming to visit. So it's better than we thought it was going to be, I think.
Well, there's a huge tourism in Vietnam, at
Mm-hmm.
least there was until
Mm-hmm.
COVID. But
Yeah,
yeah, there's beach resorts and there's all kinds
yeah.
of things there now. So have you been there?
No, I would love to go, but the miracle of YouTube. I've visited a lot, virtually, but I would love to go.
Okay, let me get back to Agent Orange real quick. Now,
Okay.
is with your research, is there a possibility that somebody who was affected by Agent Orange can actually pass that on through their children?
Yes.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
there's not, a lot of people are under the impression that dioxin changes your DNA, and it really does not. It does not cause mutations the way some chemicals can. But without getting into the weeds on the science, you can, what dioxin does, and we've shown it, and a number of other labs have shown it, it causes what we call epigenetic mutations. So it doesn't change the DNA, it just changes how the DNA is expressed. And so maybe you've got a piece of DNA. So it's really interesting when you think about how people develop, and how you can have an egg and a sperm unite. And from that one cell that forms, when those two fuse, you get a complex organism like a human being. And how does that happen? How does this cell become an arm and this cell become a brain? And the answer is epigenetics. All the cells have the same DNA, but not all of the DNA is expressed. And so through the miracle of epigenetics, this gene is turned off in this cell, but it's turned on in another cell. And so if you have a compound like dioxin that screws that up, so that things that are supposed to be are expressed are not, or that things that are expressed shouldn't be expressed are, that's when you can have disease. And when you have those kind of changes that occur in the germ cell, so the sperm or the egg, then you can pass that on to your children. And so that's the research that my colleague and I, Kevin Osteen, are trying to do. Can we change those epigenetic marks? You can't change DNA that's been altered. Like if you've changed the sequence, you can't fix that. But you can impact epigenetics. And so that's what we're trying to figure out. If we can change the epigenetics, we can't change, if you were exposed to dioxin and you have cancer because of that, I can't fix that. But is it possible that we could prevent you from transmitting a bad sperm or a bad egg and contributing to a child that doesn't have as good of health as they might have otherwise? That's what we're trying to do.
What would be the possible symptoms of a child who might have that?
Again, it just depends on what has been altered. I'm confident from my research that endometriosis, which is and again, I'm a reproductive biologist, so I think about reproduction. And so I'm confident that things like endometriosis, some types of prematurity are associated with paternal exposure or maternal exposure. My graduate student just had a paper accepted, and again, So this is a great example. So COVID, they all got sent home because we couldn't be in the lab, and she was just going through the necropsy notes, and she realized, we've got a lung phenotype. I'm going, well, I don't know anything about the lung, but she's showing that infants, and again, I don't study humans. We have to do this in mice, but that mice that have this exposure history are at increased risk of developing bronchopulmonary dysplasia. And that, in my opinion, I don't know, it seems like that would affect how you react to COVID. So if you have this history of exposure, is that going to make COVID infection worse? And it seems like it might, but that's, sorry, I get off in the weeds. I'll talk about the science all day if you let me.
Well, that's all right. I was just curious because I knew nothing about it. I didn't know that Agent Orange exposure could be passed on.
Absolutely, and I don't recommend it, but the children that are in Vietnam now that were born in areas of heavy exposure, so at least our soldiers came home and they quit being exposed to it. But if you think about the Vietnamese population that were living in, Da Nang or Hue or some of the areas that were heavily exposed, if they didn't leave that part of the world, they're continuing to be exposed, and so they constantly get re-exposed. And then some of those children that are born just have the most horrific birth defects that you can imagine. And that's what I'm saying. I don't recommend. You can look it up on YouTube if you want to, but I do not recommend it. I mean, it's absolutely horrific, and it just breaks your heart that something that we did to try to help our soldiers has been so devastating to that country. We're trying now to do some remediation, but it's a long, expensive process, and it's never going to be enough, in my opinion.
Well, the Vietnam War seems to be like a can of worms that the more you dig into it, the worse it gets. And it was controversial when it was going on.
Yes.
There were certainly a lot of people in this country that were against the war. And, you look back on it now, 40, 50 years, and with what you're telling me, there's still remains of this war, yeah?
Yes, and I'm afraid it's going to be with us for a long time.
Yeah, that's sad. That is too bad. So just quickly before we wrap this up, so your book series is, you said it's historical fiction.
Yes.
Is there one central character? Or is it multiple? Or?
It's multiple characters. The first book, there is a very, very minor character that actually becomes a major character in the second book. The second book, there's, like if it were a movie, and it's not, but if it were, there'd be like almost a co-starring player that will become a major character in book 3. But they're very different stories. The first book is really about a woman trying to figure out who she is. And then the second book, there's actually, the 2 storylines, 3 storylines. One storyline is a serial killer that's writing his memoir. And then another storyline is a DNA analyst trying to track him down using the same techniques that were used to catch the Golden State Killer, forensic genealogy. And then the third storyline tells the friendship of 2 soldiers, an American soldier and a Vietnamese soldier. And they become very good friends and work together, do a lot of missions together. And so there's like these 3 storylines that are occurring in the second book. And then in the third book, I'll take a character that was again in the second book, and she becomes a major character in the third book. She was an orphan in Vietnam. And that's the other thing that I talk about a lot. The unintended consequences of war, and all of these children that were born to Western servicemen, and they were not welcome in Vietnam, and they were not going to have a good life in Vietnam, and oftentimes they would be abandoned, and they'd grow up on the street. And so the third book will tell the story of a street child and what happens to her.
Well, we do have to wind this down. Thank
Okay.
you so much for coming on the show. Do you have a website that you want to give out?
I do. It's KaylonBrunerTran.com, just all one word, and they can find the books, and they can find a little bit more about my research if they want to.
Okay, great. Well, thanks again for coming on, and best of luck with your book series. And
Thank you.
Thank you for
Thank you. I
sharing.
really appreciate it.